Hello everyone, quite important video today. For the first time after the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, aside from a few things I've made in the ensuing month, mostly not about the war per se, but some general perspectives and, also providing also more Ukrainian history background, etc. I start what I have in hindsight should have done really already at the time, that is to say, documenting periodically the course of the war. Also because I took a very precise stand at the beginning of it and throughout all my Schwerpunkt content, regardless of what people subscribe for, I have always been very clear about, and, I've continued reasserting. And that I really want to do not much to join the fray of sort of coverage for reasons that are obvious, like there is so much coverage in general. I go around saying that I'm an expert in the art of war, and I yet obviously am not an expert about any war that is fought, not even present ones just per se. I'm just a medievalist, but I have also some broader ambition. I would like, if anything, to see, first of all, where this goes for the channel. The main reason being actually personal, right? I'm doing this for moral reasons that are not obviously just connected with the war, but with something that is much deeper and much more meaningful for me at a level that I hope that one day will change my life. And again, you have no way to know what this specifically is, but that I care about very much. And so I, in many ways, knew that I had to do this, even like not making the channel about this, but essentially providing with that basic, still reliable information, and of course also Schwerpunkt's criticism regarding this major war that we are living, or at least, though people over there are living, and today we mostly see as just, we're habituated to it. Like there's the war in Ukraine, it's a huge deal from a military standpoint, especially if you think about pre-2022, how every single, minimal engagement somewhere in the world was hyper-analyzed from a strategical point of view. Oh my God, this is the future of warfare, whatever. And then, when this thing broke out, was mostly, we adapted to that as if, nothing really was. But there are obviously, self-evidently, so many reasons for which it's important to stay tuned with that. If anything, and I say this also with a level of cynicism, of course, it offers, from a military historical point of view, a lot of insight that, as we know, however, as Clausewitzians, are ultimately political in nature, right? As war is just essentially an act of violence enacted to compel the enemy to fulfill our will, but by definition. And that, however, is also a continuation of politics with other means, and so an instrument of politics, and that cannot be understood, nor historically, nor anthropologically, nor culturally, but through politics, right? Years ago, I remember, Schwerpunkt, you're too cool to be political. You can't do that. On this channel, I don't make any specific particular propaganda. As you know, I have very strong beliefs, as you know, and at the same time, I think you can and you should prove that the more you nail essentially what goes on in the world, in reality, and the more this helps understanding, but also settling matters, because traditionally wise, there is no such thing like false propaganda going anywhere, right? You can't reduce people's strength because it's false and it's wrong, but if you accurately document what goes on, this always goes in favor of the right side, right? And this happens, as you know, theologically through the Imperium, through what we discuss in our History of Religion videos. But it's very important to delve into also the informational space of this war that naturally, again, people think, oh my God, now there is the internet, social media, this is like the biggest deal, whatever. Politically, this thing is fought over, all that, absolutely true. But it's not like in relative terms, this was not going on in any other war, or even just particularly for this war. Every war since antiquity was that. In fact, I would like also to start a series on war journalism, because there is in fact, a specific informational theme that can really help understanding war, because at the end of the day, it is about information. It is about how you tell the story. And so I think that for a channel like mine, this is crucial as well, because we have to prove here that obviously we are doing something accurately as well as reliably, as people are fundamentally phobic about this, where you get information. What it is, the important is for the information to be reliable and accurate, also when it is in fact a critical opinion of mine that can be more or less aligned with reality, but still not surely doing so out of whim or personal volition, right? We can all sort of get mistaken, but the truth still is there, and it doesn't change. It's mostly our problem, and that's what I think should always prompt a proper attitude to this. So given that this is the first episode of this series, that I naturally hope to be as short as possible for obvious reasons, I will not really illustrate what I'm going to do, if not by saying that we will just look at the context, the political one of the current days, of course, in the broader background, of course, of it all, the newest information, and essentially and briefly what is happening. I use this expression on the ground, which is a terminology that you will know everybody tells you, like, weaponizes for making their own personal propaganda, like, why were you there on the ground? Which is actually what I say myself, like, to people that, often make that punchline. People who say this do not know the situation on the ground. I said, yeah, because, like, instead you're there on the ground and you know better, right? And so the situation on the ground is simply, like, what's going on in the various theaters of this war. And say the various sectors, so to say, of the front, whatever you want to call them, that, of course, measure also what happens. Remember, always, because otherwise we're not Clausewitzians anymore. Yes, what is happening from a military point of view, but not at large what is happening from a political point of view. Of course, the military dimension compounds, but it's not the immediate reflection of. Right, and I think that this war has, and it's not the only one that followed a similar course, like perfectly illustrates why this thing happens. Like, it's just, I could make so many examples to explain how even people with the same, with a brain that is wired in terms of, I will side only from which political side of the aisle I want to push, evidently misunderstand from a strictly military historical point of view, because there are some attritional wars that went in a direction and another, and that according to this people's logic, should be instead the same thing, and they themselves at some point either deny that course or deny what actually the underlying principle of the strategy and how this should turn into politically. Should be, but in any case, this is yet another concept. It should be factually based. So yesterday, May the 19th, because I, by the way, record the day before, as you know. So today is the 20th. You will listen to this on the 21st. In any case, on May the 19th, 2025, US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin engaged in this 2-hour phone call to address Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. And that is a development, of course, widely reported by international media and announced by Trump on Truth Social, etc. Of course, this is not unimportant, but I think that any person with some minimal acumen shall realize that this is just a ballet that is going on from too much of a long time. What was all predictable is, of course, that Trump would initially act as if, he was going. You've seen what happened with Zelensky in February, etc. But obviously predictably would realign towards, of course, support towards Ukraine, because the military fundamentals and especially the political interests of the sides involved remain the same, right? It's not like administration changes and all of a sudden American interests or in the one of their allies and the relations that rest on these connections suddenly change for some reason. This is not the world of reality. That's the world of the mentally feeble that, of course, are the same ones that I said before, by spreading propaganda, do not really change anything in practice, because there is no ground in reality support that direction. It is not to say that the world is predictable to that extent, but there are some big dynamics that, as much as they can change, and also in this case have heavily been undermined and shattered, and also just from a mental point of view broken, like even as a sort of taboo as far as certain postures, as certain words, as certain behaviors are still there, and of course were not likely at all to simply vanish in the air as some people would have liked, or maybe still think is happening, but which is even worse, and it does happen. Just open X for that matter. Now, so that's we have to give just that minimal space to the information. Trump stated, of course, that he and Putin agreed that Russia and Ukraine would immediately begin bilateral negotiations to establish both a ceasefire and a peace agreement with the terms to be negotiated by the two parties alone, as they possess the specific details. And he described the conversation's tone as essentially positive, noted that he subsequently contacted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, French President Emmanuel Macron, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, to inform them that bilateral negotiations would commence immediately. Right, and so Trump expressed even the wish for the Vatican to be essentially, in his view, like he's very interested in hosting the negotiations there, and he highlighted potential U.S.-Russian trade revival post-war. This is also, say, important in the sense that whenever you hear what Trump actually says, of course, in the West, it should be outrageous to hear things that tend to align with Putin's view, etc. But I think, on the other hand, that in the same media has not, which is normally a bit, as you know, to say the least, liberal biased in most of the West, highlighted the times in which Trump actually said something was heavily against, say, of course, Putin and much pro-Ukraine, such as at some point in January, he openly stated, like, if Russia doesn't quit it, we will. This is after the, he was had formally become president, etc. He highlighted the point: we'll fill Ukraine with weapons, if the Russians do not stop. And it's not like, regardless of what all the buffoonery surrounding all the other statements, the fundamentals of this change, but that statement was not publicized as much as this statement of, for example, the US and Russia could, by the way, revive trade after. It's just like saying what if, right? So it obviously pushes emotionally towards the notion of, oh yes, now he's friend with Putin. But if you actually hear even the things he says, that's something else. And I would say that it's clever from Trump, regardless, or at least to use this kind of language. What is not clever, perhaps, is the general idea of what this should be about, because we're supposed to believe that there is this deep negotiational effort for which, Trump said it even in the face of Zelensky, like, I can't, piss the Russians off if I want to negotiate with them. But indeed, even the single statement is not per se the end of the world. It may be just in the broader picture pretty fucked up, but for all the other things that have been said, but in our terms, it doesn't mean anything. And so you shouldn't even be that worried about that. Besides, Trump, of course, added that Ukraine could benefit from trade during its reconstruction process. And again, this is just talking about hypotheticals. Concerns, of course, persist that Putin is concerns to say the least. This is a certainty, regardless, and that's the counterpoint. In fact, the strains that that Russia is keeping to take. Like all those people say, sanctions were useless. No, they were not useless, right? If there hadn't been there, Russians would be in a much better place right now, and fatigue over time, regardless of the objective resilience of the Russian system, do not, in fact, really mean that the latter is also particularly powerful either, that this war can't last forever, especially, and that's the actually most important strategical point about war in general. This war exemplifies very well that you can't even pump soldiers in, and this can even be a war of attrition. And surely Ukrainians are paying a too high toll, morally, and a very high toll strategically for this. But at the same time, if this attrition does not yield also concrete, strategically expandable objectives, right? It's not actually playing in favor of Russia at all, right? And always think about David and Goliath. Think, as I was hinting at before, telling the truth, about how many wars kept being fought with conviction, and at the end of the day, you would arrive at the bottom of the barrel. But there is also, and von Clausewitz explained this pretty well, just so much you can do in the moment, in the beginning, right? You can set on some tracks, and technically, even when things go worse and become critical, you should remain on that track. But effectiveness, especially of the offensive, is increasingly limited, right? It increasingly jams down. And it's not like the Russians, again, can't keep injecting, especially meat and ammo into the system, but the capacity simply of keeping this together and keeping on to motivate the system to simply take over Ukraine is something that nobody sees literally the end of at any point. And this suggests by that measure that actually the Ukrainian resilience is more than enough at this point, and in the medium term, at least, to resist this slaughter. Now, I'm not going to make the simple take that this is essentially how things go, because I say all the time that, of course, nothing is predictable in the moment, especially in which it is contextualized in not much, like people say, the ground reality, but say the world as it is. I mean, strategic analysis correctly don't go beyond, say, 4 months, because in 4 months, approximately, in the world can happen also so many different things that we just can't profitably calculate. And there are also bigger ones that can even immediately happen, like a solar tempest or whatever, that you just don't have control on. As I said, since the beginning, I thought this war was lost by Russia the moment they set foot in Ukraine. But again, we are here documenting the war still 3 years later, and so whatever the personal beliefs, what has happened in these 3 years is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important of course, to keep documenting the effort, right? Because there are people who are fighting and dying in ways that you don't even picture minimally from the distance as a person, like what it means to get into that, what it means to be in such a war for such a long time, or to hear air alarms at night, not being able to sleep, or just worrying for a relative that is fighting, or maybe literally suffering, like saying hi to someone and getting killed by a strike in a civilian context all of a sudden. So it's something that is incredibly important. Also, were we just to document this from a merely Clausewitzian lens, which is not a mere one, but definitely the one that so far we best have to understand the reality. Nobody really surpassing von Clausewitz in this sense. And so obviously we know that Russia is avoiding commitments by potentially undermining any negotiation process by protracting discussions without meaningful concessions. And at this point, I can't say anymore that if I were Putin, I would simply keep fighting, right? This is something I thought up to, say, 1 year ago. I would say objectively, yes, it makes sense to continue. At this point, it's much more complicated, right? It's something that is taking an increasing toll, and just the fact that there are these conversations going on, even were they just simply a scam, is in the sense it's not credible in general. Even if the Russians themselves want this to be over, but just don't know exactly themselves, of course, without losing face and basically much more than that, and the same war. So Zelensky confirmed that he spoke with Trump before and after the Trump-Putin call, reaffirming Ukraine's readiness for a full unconditional ceasefire, which is obviously, the thing that in last weeks is fully as intelligently written, just to show that what is obvious under any point of view. Of course, the Russians do not want any of this, at least on their improposable terms. And of course, like Trump had already proposed this kind of, especially with the death of Pope Francis, the election of Pope Leo XIV, like there seems to have been a recovered concord among probably like a different moral climate within Western leadership as far as this broader alignment towards like reaching what is rightfully called like the hope, like the ideal of a just peace. So Zelensky stated that Ukraine is prepared for direct negotiations with Russia in any format, literally, and offered Turkey, the Vatican, or Switzerland as possible venues, himself emphasizing the need for American and European representatives at the appropriate level, quote unquote, in the process. And he also urged Russia to break its pattern of prolonging negotiations and failing to offer meaningful concessions, stressing that legitimate, good faith negotiations are essential for any lasting or sustainable end to the war. Putin, speaking to journalists on May the 19th, stated that Russia would present Ukraine with a memorandum, which is basically the usual passive-aggressive Russian way of saying, here nobody understands us, we're the poor, mistreated ones, we have to remind the terrible Ukrainians what reality is, or whatever, detailing conditions and timing for a future peace treaty. As the two countries are moving hopefully towards bilateral negotiations. He emphasized that that's the worst thing you can, which truly means that you have no intention to stop the war at all. Emphasizing Russia's main concern as eliminating the war's root causes. So basically the notion that Ukraine, at least formally on paper, that means that Ukraine should be completely demilitarized, neutral, whatever. And so basically the Russians can simply roll into it. So reiterating essentially the Kremlin's narrative calling for the replacement of Ukraine's current government, by the way, with a Russian proxy government. And so Ukraine's commitment to neutrality, which means basically annexation as it's gradually happening with Belarus that it's already done for. And by the way, the Russian presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, added that Trump and Putin discussed a possible 949 U.S.-Russian prisoner exchange, indicating the secondary issues being raised also in the talks, which are just, food for talk, basically, to show that something has been done in the first place, that there have recently been, sort of substantial prisoners exchange. And so the current negotiations face significant hurdles, to say the least, as they are rooted in Russia's, and so the ones we have, namely, let's say, the upper hand, say, refusal to recognize the legitimacy of Ukraine's president, but properly government and also constitution, which with such demands you basically just say they are not there. And so in terms of reality denying, in post-Soviet terms, that's pretty pretty school book, let's say. And Putin and Kremlin officials, as recently as some few years ago, falsely claimed again the notion that Zelensky is essentially a legitimate leader according to the Ukrainian constitution, and that all governments since 2014 are invalid. And so, of course, we don't even have to specifically address this. Today, we will mostly address the main thing that surfaced, again, especially the content of the possible agreements of what Russia had proposed also in 2022 that was rejected by Ukraine for very obvious reasons when you understand the actual content that, as you know, is not fully out there, but we have multiple sources relating to is also clear as no, let's say. And this is the point. Russians are assessing simply to aim at setting conditions for Russia to renege on future agreements at its discretion. That's basically what they're saying, right? Which is not definitely a mature or intelligent way, if at least your purpose is negotiation, so that you can actually rule the latter out entirely in that sense. And or at least you can have this kind of passive-aggressive rhetoric, because always remember that nearly everything that Russians publicly say, it's for domestic purpose, right? It's also weird how, as Westerners, every time, at least some media specifically, every time something happens, some word that the Russian officials say, it's all of a sudden, oh my God, the Russians sent it. The Russians are primarily, every Russian government is historically paranoid that their people is going at some point to make them collapse, all right? And not because their people has this great vocation for liberty or any kind of civil value, but exactly because of that, because they perfectly know that government have no legs to stand on for a long run, especially when they put the system under prolonged stress. Of course, Ukraine's constitution explicitly prohibits elections during martial law, like in any sort of intelligent country, like not even the UK held elections during World War II. And it's not like Churchill was an illegitimate leader. And of course, this condition of martial law under which Ukraine is by constitution remains in place for the obvious reason of the threat of attack or danger to the state independence of Ukraine and its territorial integrity, which is literally what the constitution says, and that it's literally what is going on with Russia's invasion. So without Russia's explicit acknowledgement of the legitimacy of Ukraine's president, government, and constitution, meaningful good faith negotiations are obviously impossible, and so nobody should be surprised of that, because if you heard about the world narrative, it's just like the Russians passively aggressively not wanting to let go even when they're failing and hoping to get like a tiny bit or whatever they can hope to achieve in this way extra, or having this wishful thinking that basically the West is weak and that they are the strong ones instead, and so pretending they can simply manipulate others as they do with their own people, and that this is not how it goes down, right? I can tell you this, that there is at least some virtue in many Westerners' ignorance. That is to say, most people do not give objectively a damn, unfortunately, nor about Ukraine, which is what we have sadly learned throughout these years at large, but nor about Russia. So it's not like, probably, I don't know, Putin very well knows that Westerners do not give a damn, but in that sense, if they don't give a damn, there's not even anything that Russia can practically do exploiting this general lack of interest, because who is at the top, who is in charge, of course, knows that it's a whole Western interest to have Ukraine intact, independent, and sovereign. And we don't even have to list the obvious reasons why this is the case. Now, one aspect here that is interesting in general is how in front of these apparent renewal of negotiations pushed more and sort of exploiting that hope for manipulation, respectively, by Trump and Putin in 2025, there have been echoes about the 2022 Ukraine-Russia negotiations. You probably remember that these were there were different negotiations, but we're talking about the most important one, the one that also happened pretty early on, a few months before, after the beginning of the war. That is to say, the unsuccessful Constantinople. Yes, I will never say the other name. Constantinople talks. We will take it back to over time, which produced 2 draft agreements. So why do I bring this up? Because of showing you a bit of what basically the inconsistency of any effort to frame, I don't know, Ukraine as a sort of proxy state of the West that basically without it would simply crumble, because we all know that it belongs to Russia and the Ukrainians do not exist and all that stuff, you know. And as documented in Foreign Affairs, Critical Close proposed that 4 or 5 countries, including Russia, because this was part of the agreements that they eventually the sides disagreed to. I mean, Ukraine disagreed to specifically. So that this 4 or 5 countries, including Russia, would oversee ceasefire violations. Now, imagine, do you realize how ridiculous, right? How can, you see, there is, as you know, like in Indo-European tradition, specifically the notion that with lies you lose, like the Holy Ghost moves away, the imperium cannot be achieved. So this imbeciles basically, like in the initial draft, consider this permitted a majority vote, right? That is to say 3 out of 5 mathematically, right? So to determine violations without requiring unanimous consent, right? Which already would have created problem. But this is the most ridiculous thing of all. A subsequent draft granted Russia veto power, so allowing it to block rulings against itself if it violated a ceasefire. Obviously enough, Ukraine rejected this provision. We'll talk about this further now. What are our sources? What do we know about that? Because obviously enough, Ukrainians were unwilling to permit the aggressor to judge, undermine their own actions as it undermined the agreement's integrity. So these are the important names. David Arakamia was the head of Ukraine's 2022 delegation in Constantinople, right, revealed in an interview with Natalia Moseichuk. This is all available, by the way, also in Ukrainian with subtitles, that Russia offered peace on the condition that Kyiv abandoned NATO membership but provided no security guarantees whatsoever, demanding neutrality without assurances. All right. So again, it's always this initial notion that Ukraine should have simply, of course, not entered NATO at any cost, because at that point the Russians could have simply not even stepped into that. And of course, at that point, so with Russia having already invaded Ukraine in large scale, aside from, of course, what had happened in 2014, but in that period, the moment in which, the Russians had just withdrawn properly from Kyiv, right? The country rejected this proposal as, of course, also complete capitulation, because it entailed also disarmament, right? Neutrality was not, coming just with some kind of opinable political alliance of international placement. It literally meant like Ukraine could not basically receive even any help from anyone, could have simply also not embarked itself in further rearmament, whatever. So guarantees that really resembled a Versailles-style treaty. And this is literally what Germany was proposed after World War I, right? And as you know, I think that also that was a very different situation. Of course, you can't compare the two things, but let's say in the intention, like the proper Russian demand was Ukraine to be demilitarized, right? That's at the end of the day what the Russians want, because they know that as a nuclear power, NATO cannot simply intervene against Russian troops and vice versa. And so if Ukraine is considered like a neutral zone where nobody can enter, and the Russians will enter first, because also NATO at that point would not likely enter a neutral Ukraine. The actual chances of Ukraine to withstand a Russian occupation would be no, right? And of course, and consider the context here. We're talking early 2022, the first half of 2022, right? So a moment in which the war was also in a pretty heated moment, in which, by the way, Ukrainians, as you know, at the end of the season managed to retake large amounts of the territories that the Russian army at that point was practically worn out, because, as you know, the initial force was ridiculous for the task of taking over a country like Ukraine with twice its force, right? But it was, at least from a technical standpoint, like an okay army, right? And in fact, they performed. I mean, they broke through Ukraine in the north. They arrived in Kyiv. There were tanks entering the main alley, etc. But of course, that's also why I said at the time, even though it was also in a pretty dark, moment, and not just for this actually paradoxically saved my mind, because you remember what was happening at the time. I will not digress, but of course, what happened along the way, and that was simply also because Putin at some point had to issue a mobilization, threaten nuclear use, etc., to slow down, right? Of course, Ukrainians themselves had been spent because they were exhausted considering what had happened that year, but they had recovered an incredible amount of territory. By the way, there is also another option that would have been at that point striking in Zaporizhzhia, which Zaluzhny had proposed. That would have been incredible, because could have severed simply Crimea off, and the troops bottled, also they're just withdrawn from Kherson. And so, but let's say that's for another video, if anything. We will hopefully talk about this quite soon, at least if in fact the war is over, because it's a very, very interesting turning point in the war that has not been properly. There were two options: the east or the south, right? And Zaluzhny had proposed something and eventually was not enacted. Things went well for the Ukrainians in the east. But in a strictly, say, strategical and operational sense, like a breakthrough in the south would have been the end of the Russian army there. And again, if, of course, things had also gone well for Ukrainians at that point, which is not, we will not likely ever know. The aforementioned Arakamian noted that Russia prioritized Ukraine's neutrality over secondary issues like denazification of the Russian language, even on the Constantinople 22 thing, meaning that, again, what is that the Russians really want? They don't want Ukraine to be a military power, all right? Because we see why. We see it from 3 years. And so the whole BS about the denazification, the entire issue of, again, Ukrainian does not exist, whatever, it's of course just the usual Russian buffoonery. It has nothing to do with any practical reality. The practical reality is, of course, that Ukrainians knew how to defend themselves pretty darn well. And so what is interesting about that is that the same Arakami, because this is the source, stated that Ukraine was actually close to agreeing to a Finland-style neutral stance to end the war. If anything, because at that point there was a very heavy pressure, and so it seemed as if, even just from a moral standpoint, Ukraine had almost collapsed, and just now there was some ground, because you remember, this was a total scramble, right? And it was very difficult in the moment to tell what could have happened. But of course, the fact that Ukraine was still standing on its legs, and especially the demilitarization clauses, and this weird, again, draft about the veto power of Russia in the infringement of ceasefire, etc., was simply unacceptable, right? And that's how the deal collapsed upon the delegation's return to Kyiv, right? And Oleksiy Arestovich, that is, by the way, a political rival of Zelensky, confirmed in a private conversation that the deal's failure was not due to an external influence. I say this, again, because people think that fundamentally there was the usual story that Ukrainians were simply doing what, I don't know, Biden said at the time. This is not the case. And Arestovich is actually a very interesting figure exactly because he's a political rival of Zelensky. He stated basically that he could not really assign blame in that direction, refuting claims also of specifically Boris Johnson's influence, because the British Prime Minister, as you know at the time, had arrived in Kyiv the very day after the delegation's return, making his alleged role also implausible, by the way, in that alleged influence. Arakamiya reported that Putin briefly displayed an 18-point draft agreement to an African delegation. I skipped the jokes that I could make about his past. If it wasn't something so serious, like, you would just laugh about what Russians were doing all this, right? And we know, at least from that occasion, that this draft imposed a severe disarmament, which, again, is the most important thing, prohibited NATO membership. And NATO membership, by the way, I would like to stress, is not something you can get from a day to another. Right. Also because NATO not just has all the problem of the fact that members have to collectively agree, etc., but especially in a country that is at war with literally another one having invaded it, having all these disputed areas, not clear boundaries, all to settle, just like today they still are too. By default, does not get there. Right, and it's not even about NATO, right? If there were a political will to simply say, okay, it's just like the, blocking the airspace over Ukraine, right? Creating a no-fly zone. In the beginning, it's arguable, but I think it was kind of okay, not great one. Honestly, to have a bit of fun, I would really like to see if, the West had created a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but we could have easily have gone at war with the Russians at that point. World War III would have broken out. So in line of principle, how brutally cynical it is for the people who got bombed ever since in Ukraine because of lack of air cover, that's something terrible. On the other hand, also, I don't know, Meloni, for example, even proposed, like, why don't we extend, let's say, a fictitious NATO membership to Ukraine? Like, if you really want to do that, we treat Ukraine, we don't make Ukraine into NATO, but we treat Ukraine as if this was NATO's, and so if you attack that, you attack NATO, right? Which is very complicated. It requires at least a very strong will that unfortunately is not there, but also, of course, a risk for escalation. And the Russians' red lines now have become like, how many red lines were that we already broke without anything obviously happening for obvious reasons. It's not like either NATO or Russia want to go to war with one another, right? This has been incredibly evident throughout the whole story. It's not like Russia doesn't have aggressive postures that can threaten NATO, but indirectly so. In fact, all this story that, again, they can't simply invade us, this is not a thing, but they can invade other countries that are not NATO, that can make Russia become more powerful at some point to maybe bring in some future to an actual escalation and worse throughout that, say before, in between, which is also something that, just like with Ukraine, which is by far the most important country that Russia could make this to, also the entire basically sort of still Soviet military doctrine that the Russians still have in practice, which is also still the Ukrainian, telling the truth, was, as you know, designed on mobile warfare in the Ukrainian steppes, right, in the open fields of Ukraine. See how it ended, by the way. But this is why this is also so important. This war is specifically that important. In any case, again, it's not much. This is the bottom line. It was making it's not just much about NATO membership as a problem solver. That's ideally a problem solver. To get there is much more complicated. You can much more easily end this war by pumping in all kind of weapons into Ukraine, especially at ridiculous costs for the United States to spend an incredibly, overwhelmingly larger amount of stuff for completely useless stuff. And Americans have an enormous amount of weapons, of ammo, etc., that vehicles, they do not, the state air, nothing, right, literally rotting. It can immediately be shipped to Ukraine, and it's really huge. It's something incomparable, like that gives you an idea of U.S. military power to begin with when you compare it to the sum. It is by far surpassed the sums of all other Western countries, and not only, of course, but about the 2022 Turkish meetings, negotiations. This is not over because you have Dmitry Kozak, that is a Russian delegate responsible for the Ukraine portfolio before the 2022 war, who proposed annexing and recognizing the two separatist republics in eastern Ukraine, a plan that Putin rejected in the favor of a full-scale invasion, as reported by Reuters and elaborated in expanded accounts. All right, I will skip also the considerations of people that the day before the invasion were joking that there was no Russian invasion. The day after, they were shouting, let's kill all these fags, etc. But, just to make you specifically picture the psychophysical feebleness of the subjects we're talking about, as it's been brilliantly proven, but of course also the Ukrainian slaughter made of them afterwards in the fields of Ukraine, right? Just to test the situation on the ground, right? In any case, the convergence, like here you have, I repeat it, of accounts from Arakamia, Arestovich, and Kozak, so representing respectively a Ukrainian negotiator, a Zelensky critic, and a Russian insider, confirms that Russia's unacceptable terms, including neutrality without assurances and severe disarmament, were the primary obstacle to the 2022 talks, which is the reason why there is a war to begin with, or better, not even, because as we've seen, Putin had deliberately said, okay, we don't give a damn about the smaller thing, simply annexating the areas that have Russian majority, depending also on which ones they are, because of the ridiculous referendums that were done later with 99.9% like favor towards. Right? I mean, why do you even do it? Right? Isn't it ridiculous enough? Right? I will skip other considerations, but just to be clear, just how the complete ridiculousness of this all. Right? And in fact, that even this is very important, because even Russophiles in the West, once presented with this basic information, let's not even talk about the negotiations about the late no negotiation, like literally corridor voices about between American and Russian officials after the Soviet Union collapsed. Oh, please don't make NATO expand in the East. Just because one guy told, oh yeah, no, we don't think about that. That is supposed to be a condition, an agreement, a pact, as if, by the way, the will of half of Europe, politically wise, independently wise, had no word whatsoever. But every time you corner, at least people who allow themselves to be cornered in general, to be exposed to their own idiocy, regarding, again, the 2022 notion that, in fact, allegedly Ukraine would have refused because somebody called them back from the West, with the actual evidence available on this, they usually accept. That's one of the few instances in which, indeed, right, how do you think that Ukraine could have, at that point, said, in the moment in which you're invaded, says, surrender, disarm yourself? Why? We can fight for our own independence. Why should we do that? It's dumb, right? What kind of person would even stay to that? And that is the measure of how much, of course, Ukraine, not just is not Russia, but of course is able to stand on its own legs. There is a beautiful passage of the von Kriege, by the way, that we commented on back in the day, that was talking about the partition of Poland, right? That von Clausewitz would end up losing his life as a secondary consequence, unfortunately. And von Clausewitz states it very clearly: no country that can't rest on its legs is going to be supported by any ally, right? So the notion also, which is even more childish, I think this is YouTube comment style rather level, that Ukraine fights only and successfully defends itself because the Westerners give them weapons, is not correct, right? It's not that Ukrainians would be in a better place if that didn't happen. Absolutely. But the notion that countries sustain themselves just because there is another country props them up, aside from the fact it always happens in any war, but without that, basically, it would immediately collapse. It's nonsense, all right? And we will talk about this stuff also in other dives on the topic. So the Russians were ambiguous, to say the least, about the actual honesty about any kind of sort of peaceful settlement as well, because in the moment in which you're a Russian and you propose this negotiation, it's not like Russians are essentially stupid in absolute terms. It's like, obviously they're telling Ukrainians to surrender, and so they know what they're asking. It's not like they believe that Ukrainians actually, well, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of Russians that believe that, but definitely not Russians that have much of a view of reality. Indeed, the same 22 invasion of Ukraine was so reckless in that it's one of the greatest failures in the history, in the annals of military history, just by, say, manual of like basic strategy, like how you don't even think to invade a country like that, hoping to knock it out with insufficient forces. Like normally the 3-to-1 relation is the offender versus the defender. This was inversed, and how do you think this is not going to escalate into a major quagmire, right? With you being forced at that point, for even more compelling political reasons, not to lose face into sending, hundreds of thousands of your so-called citizens, not to say serfs, into the meat grinder itself. In any case, indeed, many anti-Atlantists, let's put it in, anti-Atlanticists would say better, definitely concede that the Russians in 2022 were not presenting acceptable terms for Ukrainians. Except, I would say, the problem with them is that these figures normally and publicly make speeches, even, I don't know, at the European Parliament saying otherwise. As I said before, if you're not familiar with European tradition, you think that lying is something that you end up accepting, which in the past would meant you were practically not a man. You were completely devoid of your virility. It's something that does not matter. It's like, what is your purpose, right? Is it, I don't know, because you're taking Russian money? It's not even, you can't say that everybody who makes that statement is actually subsidized by the right. What do you think to go with that? Yes, you can get votes. Sometimes you can be paid by people who are going to get votes if you say these things. But in general, these things surface. And it's not even like in this case, like you don't know what is actually going on. So it's the worst of the worst. It's just like the worst thing you can do. And so any notion that there would be a Western pressure causing Ukraine's rejection of Russian proposals in 2022 is a narrative contradicted by the aligned accounts of Arakami, again Arestovich and Kozak. And it should be remembered in 2025 when we're talking about peace agreements as well. And at this point, everything is much calmer, so to say, much more settled, especially after 3 years, and much more supervised, because at this point it's the narrative that also all the philo-Russians have stressed. We want to end the war. Trump will make us end the war because people are dying. It's terrible. We're spending our tax money for weapons. We're a terrible thing. And at this point, there's no way the Russians can come out of this clean if they blatantly say no. And obviously, Ukrainians are going to play this very well instead in the current situation. And it's a good moment in this sense, diplomatically speaking. The pendulum swings, unfortunately, always. But in this moment, we are, at least from the side of we are in the right position to properly act in that direction. Finally, the same issue has resurfaced, partially because current negotiations have stalled, of course, returning to the initial deadlock to a degree. That's also the pendulum that is swinging here, however, at another level. with, for example, Rubio's threats of sanctions prompting Trump's call with Putin to resolve the impasse, which is the good way to go. Of course, there's been talks just in the last days, of course, we're stating properly from US officials that their Congress is going to pass sanctions, further sanctions against Russia. And at this point, also the EU, targeting mostly the shadow fleet of 200, cargoes that resupplies Russia, that trying to, ship gas, etc., to circumvent the various blocks, etc. In fact, in all this, Putin's lack of commitment to peace does not also reveal anything else. Like, it delays progress, it's expanding resources, with Trump gradually acknowledging, at least publicly acknowledging Putin's intentions. I don't think Trump is stupid as he seems sometimes. I think he has a component of genius and a component of real idiot, right? And I'm not kidding here. But the first one may be actually more than it seems. And I really say it because I think that in many ways the US administration is not great, to say the least, but Trump may be actually one of the most moderate in thinking individuals there, regardless also of other unforgivable things that he said, etc. But if you look at them on the bigger picture, they may be more instrumental than they seem. And actually, remember when, and so people are so emotional, let's be honest, when Trump's meeting at the White House was obviously a disaster. And remember how, the internet was just the day after or whatever. Look at us now. Did that matter? No, right? And at the time I told you, this is not going to matter, right? That was just the dramatic outburst that was not even properly what Trump wanted, was mostly Vance's problem, right? That's the scale, like there. The best one was Trump. In between you have Zelensky, that Vance was the worst. He had also to apologize for that. But that is incredibly useful for the US administration to say, okay, we scolded Zelensky in front of everybody. So now we did what we have to do. Now he's obeying us. And so we are the cool ones, and now everything is fine. People are so easy to manipulate, right? And obviously things have not really gone like that. They didn't go well, right? That matter could be solved much more easily. But it could be turned, in spite of the accident and the general failure, into something that, in fact, look at today where we are, all right? For the rest, Russia's negotiation stance remains inflexible, with officials demanding Ukraine's cede all of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblast. Yeah, sure, we're going to give them all to you, right? I'm still, of course, for Crimea possibly returning to Ukraine. Now, I can't say I see it happening, but believe me, like when a front collapses, remember what happened in the summer of 2023. If Wagner, it could have not happened, but had they been turned against the same Russians, like there, the entire front could have theoretically collapsed. And remember what happened in fall of 2022. At that point, the entire front risked, especially had, as I was saying before, been attacked in Zaporizhia, risked to collapse. And when there is such collapse, it's not like, again, you entrench once again. That's over, right? Ukrainians take everything back, including Crimea, right? And I'm not saying this is, again, at this point especially feasible, because obviously the Russians have a heavy upper hand and they can, again, stabilize whichever position they have gained. But at the same time, you don't know how this is going to be handled, 1 year from now, right? We've seen it also, for example, last spring, not this spring, when again Ukrainians had in part mismatched the next wave of recruitment, and in parallel the Americans had stopped the aid for reasons, by the way, that were bipartisan. The notion is that the Republicans didn't want to pay Ukraine. That's not how it happened. It was the Democrats that inserted in the bill provisions regarding the border all stuff that the Republicans could not accept. And in the end, they made an agreement specifically for aiding Ukraine, because at the end of the day, it's an all U.S. interest to have a free, sovereign Ukraine, right? But again, hypothetical scenarios aside that I don't like myself, as you know, the notion that even areas that are not currently occupied should go to the Russians, aside from any possibility, depending on the situation, hopefully for the Ukrainians would not get to that point, but say demanded, even before agreeing to a ceasefire, as reported by Western and Ukrainian sources, is harmful for the Russians. Making this I see that. I may even think that from a Russian perspective, that's the right thing to do for them, for their own interest, because it's always trying not to be lenient, stressing what they immediately want in a maximalist direction. But at some point, what's the point of doing this even before negotiations or ceasefire, serious negotiations, ceasefire has been in place, right? It just shows that there is no will whatsoever, but you still somehow act as if others should understand your special Russian mindset. We all understand it very well, right? And we feel pity for you, right? Seriously. Now, during the May 16, 2025 Constantinople talks, again, Constantinople, of course, the Russian delegation, you know what happened? They failed. They reportedly threatened to seize Kharkiv and Sumy Oblast as well, which Russia has not illegally annexed or claimed either, unlike the previous ones with the 99.9% agreement, especially of the people who were from the Ukrainian side, of course, still. Suggesting an escalation of demands typically reserved for war termination, not ceasefire talks. And it's not like Russia is exactly in the position of being able to claim that, right? This is, as I said at the beginning, it's not like we have to kid about Russian military capacity and the possibility even at some point to extend their control on other areas of Ukraine through relentless advances, even at enormous costs. But again, this comes at costs that seem disproportionate since the beginning of the war, to a point that is a bit the whole point of the war, wherever you see it. This thing is just a major Russian failure. All right, it's not like it can't go bad for the Ukrainians as well. However this thing ends, it does not end well for Russia, right? It was seen the moment they stepped in. All right, I started believing that the invasion could realistically happen from a day to another only in the last 2 weeks before the actual invasion, because I said the numbers do not add up. It's not like we wouldn't expect from the Russians to do such a thing. It's like the numbers are ridiculous. I would never go at war with Ukraine with that army. They did, and this is the result. All right, so it's obvious that Russia must agree that ceasefire negotiations precede peace settlement discussions. Right? We're not 4 years old. But this sequence is consistently rejected by the Kremlin to extract, of course, additional concessions while continuing battlefield advances that they think they can squeeze something out. How it is in the bigger picture, frankly, it doesn't make sense, as we'll see now. For now, and I don't want to digress philosophically or theoretically on how, indeed, especially considering the first person of Clausewitz Trinity, political gains should be measured on the actual, say, when to be achieved through war should be measured also in a strategical sense. Here there is a disconnect, and that's the measure of the lies of a culture, right? So the United States, Ukraine, and Europe have repeatedly called for a ceasefire, as you know, to enable diplomatic talks, but Russia's refusal to prioritize this sequence allows it to leverage ongoing military operations. And that's their only point, because again, they assume that through this attritional clash, at some point, Ukrainians will collapse. But when this point is to be, it's not nearly in sight, right? And so good luck with that. Or better, I will never wish you that, but let's say, ironically, or, that can even be done. Now, On the battlefield, Russian forces continue to shape the negotiation context, though, because they do really have the upper hand, and there is no doubt about this. Between this and they are winning the war in the sense they are going to conquer Ukraine, there is an abyss that nobody sees the end of. No analyst, no politician, nobody. All right, so let's distinguish the two levels. I hope that if you watch any YouTube channel connected to these topics, you're able to distinguish the difference between the two things. Otherwise, you really, even looking at the situation, or the actual situation on the ground, would open your eyes. But in general, like the basics of political literacy, like what are you going to gain out of this with this rate of advance, regardless of the fact that you have the initiative, that you have the upper hand. Remember always the laws of reciprocity, but also von Clausewitz's definition of the offensive and defensive are respectively the weak but positive aim and the strong and with negative aim form of war. All right. So it is indeed true that the Russians have the positive expendability, let's put it in this way, but the way they spend it may not make them get back what they want. Remember von Clausewitz's definition of war seemingly being something like sort of trade. I give you this, I give you that, right? Even when there is an actually antagonistic clash. So passing through the various sectors, the various theaters. In Kursk, actual Russian Federation, Russian forces are expanding a 30-kilometer buffered zone towards Sumy, restricting that, as you know, it's been really heavily hit. Also, it's just the most cursed city of the war, not just for the massacres that the Russians carried out there at the beginning before they left, but also the recent bombardments that are really terrifying, just striking civilians. And again, you're not going to squeeze anything out of that. It's also one of the other stupid things that the Russians did in all this war. Likely showing, by the way, they perfectly realized the Ukrainians would never be Russian, especially after this, it had there be any doubt whatsoever before, because it really brings nothing, right? It's not like you break a people like that. I can say just the Ukrainian one, which turned out to be an incredibly special people, that I make my incredible compliments to, because they're really incarnating much of what we're constantly talking about in the channel. But in general, like here, they were even wasting ammo at the beginning of the war when they had more production problems as well. It's not like they don't have, but they literally lacked ammo that they spent to hit civilians. In not really, civilian infrastructure for strategic purpose, like, literal people, like targeting blocks, right, killing children, like that, that's the Donbas thing in many ways you can do. It's definitely not going to your credit, to your honor. In any case, talking in strictly military terms here, this buffered zone towards Sumy has the objective of restricting Ukrainian unit mobility, with attacks reported in Tyoktino, northwest, causing disruptions without encirclement. Russian maneuvers along the P65 road signal potential preparations for an advance on Sumy or Kotin, right, in the Sumy Oblast, in fact, with the north-south route avoiding forested, river-heavy terrain. Current efforts focus on northeastern control, with a northern shift indicating offensive intent. Again, here they are actually going hand down. They're not trying again to create a cauldron, salients, etc. They're just grinding and this is typical of this war, by the way. Russians not knowing when to stop attacking, Ukrainians not knowing when to stop defending for some more concrete strategic expenditure. In any case, at that point, it's the Russians that have the worst of it, regardless of the various advantages that they currently enjoy in some tactical aspects. So the Kursk operation that, as you know, was initially a Ukrainian success that surprised Russia, humiliated its forces, crossed the strategic boundaries, and maintained secrecy with a favorable loss ratio, which is also extraordinary about Ukrainians. Their offensive, like in Zaporizhia, like showing, like literally taking less losses than the defenders. Something incredible, really. It tells you how good Ukrainians are, really. Failed, however, to capture Rilsk in the Sumy Oblast. This was, in fact, is a key Russian launch point for possible flank attacks as well. So it's not an easy situation, to say the least. I will also not digress on the Kursk operation that was, again, well leveraged, especially in the, like Putin says, we'll take back this in October and see how much it's taking. This is really typical, by the way. But again, it served the purpose of negotiations in a way that now is partially over, because Ukrainians were to signal the Americans, look, we have offensive capacities still if you want. Now Americans, again, have come closer. And so there are much less question marks regarding that. And so it's preferable at this point for the Ukrainians, regardless of the major moral injury of actually successfully striking into Russian territory. Not much of another strictly, or at least evidently expandable purpose. That maybe there's going to be other chances in other moments, but for now. Also in this case, after 2 weeks, gains stagnated, halting ground for negotiation leverage proved challenging. Putin conditioned negotiations on eliminating the Kursk salient, by the way. So again, yet another excuse not to negotiate. Imagine, again, you are parked with your army into an independent country boundary, and this country manages to strike you back, say, oh no, we don't negotiate because you have this. This is Russia. For in case you still haven't really realized it, whether again generally or strategically, like it seems really pitiful to begin with. Besides, as we know, Trump suspended intelligence support for 1 week, coinciding with a Russian attack resuming after the salient's elimination, suggesting coordination to remove the obstacle. This may seem really fucked up, and this was reported by contacts, at least at the Ramstein base, and Putin offered no concessions in return, indicating a strategic maneuver to maintain leverage. Alexander Shershin, commander of the 47 Separate Mechanized Brigades Magura Battalion, so Ukrainians of course, reported on X and Facebook that leadership issued ineffective orders during the Kursk operation in general. So again, I add this data because you perfectly understand that I sympathize, to say the least, with Ukraine in general, but it's not like I'm here to comb out the lies. There is a very interesting debate we can have about what Ukrainians should do and, telling the truth, or have already done to improve their military. Again, this is a post-Soviet army that largely suffers of the same issues that, as you know, these have been discussed mostly at the beginning, when the West provided all that mechanized support to say, like, these are vehicles that we employ, like in Western armies in particular ways, and these guys kind of have a completely different doctrine that is also not necessarily wasting them, like in part it was also about training them, etc. And again, they did well, but it's never about technology per se. It's probably about command and how eventually single units are going to be properly deployed. And this is very interesting, by the way. So I'm obviously going to report anything that goes wrong from the Ukrainian side as well, especially because here we're told by a guy that is the commander of the Magura battalion. So we're not talking about just a random soldier that of course speaks also for his men, but that definitely knows his deal, and that laments what, unfortunately, as predictably, like, these issues continue to plague. Of course, the Ukrainian army, again, is much better than the Russian one, and much more the latter, indeed, in however comparable ways. Essentially, Shershin requested removal from his position to disclose details right? He stated, quote, "I have never received less effective orders. I will disclose the full details later, but the losses were avoidable." So imagine knowing people, knowing comrades, brothers in arms that have bled with you, that you have that spiritual bond with, dead, because you can immediately see what went wrong. Again, I'm not there. I can't say just now I can't put my hand on fire just because of that. But it's important to report, to give it a voice. Deference to generals is futile and leads nowhere. I'm continuing to read. Discipline, investigation, and sanctions are the only responses. All right. So again, I myself, as you know, I'm pretty adverse to the notion of the butchers, etc. Maybe this guy does not know what is happening above, or maybe he knows. You can have bad generals at the same time, and these are the results unitly. In any case, Shershin indicated that the orders followed for 6 to 7 months were deemed futile, highlighting internal Ukrainian operational challenges, which extend basically ever since when essentially the Kursk operation, at least mostly when they had already gone well into Russian territory, had eventually to cope mostly with containing the Russian counterattacks, as you know, there was just so much the Ukrainians could go on, and then they had to cope with this hopefully controlled withdrawal that there were some Russian footages that were saying basically, look, we're even letting the Ukrainians escape because our commanders for some reason told us not to remember the thing, because the Russians wanted to show off, to say, look, we don't want to be the slaughterers. And there are these kind of, sometimes you even wonder whether from both sides, like, you know, what really goes on in the hierarchy, because it's not like Putin is dictating every single thing that happens on the front. But they really make you think. So it's different, sometimes even opposite reports regarding perception. And in war, definitely it's extremely difficult to understand what happens. But at least this must not be considered complementary or mechanical. These are just two anecdotes, but mutually interdependent, not really. But they're part of the same theater. And so they're interesting to look at. In Toretsk, urban combat remains deadlocked. However, Russian flanking maneuvers began 2 weeks ago, capturing 7 square kilometers, which is nothing naturally in the bigger picture, but bit by bit, that's also nothing to underestimate, around Novo Mikhailivka, with fresh units facing their Ukraine's 66th Mechanized Brigade and battalions at 4-1 or 5-1 odds, which means that the offenders have really like a high numerical advantage. But again, Ukrainians have a qualitative one. Ukraine naturally focuses on containment, with Romanivka absorbing units, threatening Shebernivka. From March the 19th to May 2025, Toretsk saw little change, but Romanivka experienced rapid Russian gains. We're looking again at fairly contained scenarios extensionally, but ones where so many people die on, that is really impressive. On May the 16th, Russians took 20 square kilometers between Kalinivka and Stara Mykolaiivka, with Ukrainian battalions holding Stara Mykolaiivka, Nativka, and Zoria, but facing encirclement risks from Alexandropil and Romanivka. Capturing Romanivka and advancing along the H-32 road endangers Shcherbinivka and Katerinivka, forcing a retreat past Western Lakes. So actually a complex territory which favors, in that sense, at least if you managed to pull a withdrawal off through the difficult terrain, which is not easy, right? It's not necessarily to simply help defenders in that phase, but after you have repositioned, likely. But in any case, in this process, still abandoning your position and therefore threatening Toretsk, right flank at the moment. Russians advance on the H-32 past Novo-Olenivka, converging with the H-20 toward Konstantinivka, behind Torsk and Konstantinivka, while targeting Mikhailivka and Malinivka, which are at this point almost completely under Russian control. At least pretty intense fighting is going on there, but the Russians have seized, say, more than 3/4, say almost, or even more than 4/5 of the wall. This aims for Mirnorad, east of Pokrovsk. Russian failures left of Pokrovsk, however, prompted a shift right, which is interesting as well. And just to say again, what's the toll that the Russians pay for these advances anyway? Visuals from May 16th to the 18th show Russian advances overwhelming Ukraine's under-equipped territorial units deployed there. And as you can see from the map, the Toretsk-Pokrovsk wedge threatens all Ukrainian lines with Russian goals phased. Phase 1, basically wherein this is the push from Toretsk targeting Romanivka and the H-32, H-20, converging at Berdikhi, that is 5 kilometers away, compromising Toretsk itself. The second phase entails escalation between Konstantinivka. Phase 3 converges on Konstantinivka from 3 sides, with a secondary push targeting Mirnorad and later Pokrovsk itself. From April the 19th to May 25, Russians exploited Ukraine's limited units by converging on key roads. And this is, again, unfortunately, a common trend that we see from quite some time, but also showing that Ukraine, if you look at the map, admittedly, in the past years, it changed much less fast, but it's not like, the map has overwhelmingly changed. You understand how Ukraine is admittedly pretty big, especially in the southern part because of the longitude at that latitude. But indeed, these are fairly poor advances. They do have definitely a strategic importance, but it's still an incredible mess in a bush of thorns, really, for every kind of possible Russian advance. There is no simple push towards any, like the people who thought last year that since, some Ukrainian units had learned how to withdraw, understanding that, of course, was not worth to lose manpower and not having enough also material to sustain the defensive. Now the highways for Kyiv were open. This is not what, of course, is happening. In any case, in Pokrovsk, if you look at the left flank, and here I don't have all the actual, I should find better map if anything, because I still haven't used. Well, I'll tell you, because I'm working on some copyrighted ones, and I don't want to use them with ads, etc. But probably I use literally, as always, the Wikimedia Commons ones, and there you can see less of the smaller settlements. But essentially, here are also details that if I give you, like, you're likely not to remember, you can find somewhere else as well. In any case, in the left flank of Pokrovsk, we're talking Udakne, Shevchenko, the Russian advances are stalled, all right? The Ukrainians are counterattacking, blocking their advances. Russians shifted to Troitsky and Kotlярivka, likely targeting Novopavlivka to bypass the deadlock as well. And so it's about finding the wedge where to break, but again, it's not easy, as in war. It's not like an area that, that was the easy road. We haven't checked it, right? In Bohoyavlenka, Russian control was confirmed in the village from May the 10th to 12th by over 12 geolocalizations from sources that you can find, like multiple sites that are following this. In any case, these include the 36 Motorized Brigade statement, despite Ukrainian counterattacks by the 33rd Mechanized, the 36th Marine, and possibly even the 46th Air Assault Brigades, who briefly retook ground, evidenced by videos removing Russian flags. Pro-Ukrainian sources reused this outdated video, however, claiming control in that town. But Russian geolocations and recent attacks west of Bohoyavlenka confirm Russian dominance in the place. Bohoyavlenka secures Oleksiivka south with no major cities beyond, and Russians have massed forces. And so there are some, this is contentious because, again, it's not a place we can immediately understand all what happens, but it seems that just in the last days, the Russians are documented to have entered the localization. Also, a Ukrainian counterattack to have taken place. However, it's possible that Bohoyavlenka is still Ukrainian. Right, surely there is a lot of pressure there, and it's possible that the Ukrainians, they're taking a stand even against the command will, or vice versa. We are partly indirectly dependent on early loss reports that have been later validated this kind of stand. Other sources are undecided whether to mark Bohoyavlenka at the moment as Russian, despite the aforementioned geolocations. This stuff happened in the past as well, for something that is very strange sometimes if you think about that, but absolutely plausible. That is to say, these damn flags, all right? There are drone-dropped flags at some point. And, for example, when Kamyanka at some point was credited as Russian, like there was this literal false flag, or at least false troop presence that cannot be measured just because you have a picture of a flag. That does not necessarily confirm capture per se. So there is a really big work behind all this. There are many sites that are constantly checking this stuff out. I'm not going to, again, descend too much into the depths of this because, again, it's unfortunately in the bigger picture, in spite of the people who died there, something that is not going to make this enormous difference. And think about this psychologically speaking as well. But this also ties you to the broader purpose why the sum of all this does matter a lot. And so, in a way or another, from both sides, this has meaning, to say the least. By the way, this Bohoyavlenka, why is it important? Well, it's a key junction. It's been heavily targeted by FABs, right? Russians, as you know, enjoyed this. That's the other. We never really talked about this stuff before, but I told you that I followed the war in Ukraine in quite some depth, and you know that the Russians are basically enjoying this advantage in long distance guided glide bombing, which basically is an advantage because it allows the Russians to shoot these bombs from literally even 70 kilometers from inland, so well far away from Ukrainian countermeasures. Sometimes can't do miracles themselves, but are largely ineffective. This is a bit like the novelty of essentially the last year of the war, a bit more even, with Russians sort of paving the way with this devastation that, however, has two limits. First of all, you don't actually gain ground just by bombing, right? You have to send troops there, And it's not like these bombs in a space like Ukraine as a whole are literally targeting everything, raising everything to the ground, right? So two, doctrinally speaking, this is coming back to the 1930s. This is basically the same tactics that the Stukas used. Say not literally the same, but the notion that you're not really integrating a close air support, etc. You're just basically throwing bombs once at a time in places where you're told to do and repeat over and over again, instead than just circling around and taking things more dynamically is really a negative thing. It's not how contemporary aviation should be able to work. That the Russians basically decided not to risk their air force after a while because they realized that they were being taken down too much aircraft. And basically we have the strange war where, of course, air war does exist, but it's reduced to a very poor thing. And so for how much, because the Ukrainians do not have any practical way to stop the FABs, but it's not like, again, the war has turned because of this either. All right. What's the phase here? The current one is Russian pushing from Velika Novosylka to Novosylka towards Pokrovsk, converging at two rivers, forcing Ukrainian withdrawal from Oleksiivka. The following phases should basically target the Dnipro Oblast, possibly with a sham annexation vote, right, in this way, and just, again, to gain ground for their political purpose. Ukrainians at that point will likely defend along rivers, aligning with, we're talking a bit far ahead, but they surely would align with Pokrovsk line that, as you see here from the map, is more expandable. Targeting, by the way, Medzova and Ivanivka in the process. Oleksiivka, that is 4 kilometers away, is vulnerable. Velika Novosylka's front per February 2025 witnessed the advances along the river to Vesele, slowing recently. However, here you can see well all the rivers. Again, I shall really find another better map, but here it does give you an idea anyway. Along the Dnipro there are other rivers, other valleys, so that it's mostly the course of it. Here I don't even have relief, etc., so it's not this enormous analysis without a proper map. But again, I have to find proper commercial purpose expandable maps, and these are, again, on Wikimedia Commons, where you see them also always at the end of the video in the credits, are the only available pictures that serve this role. At least you have geographically flattened but still precise latitudinally and longitudinally idea of what we're talking about. Russian flank moves will force Ukrainian retreats around Komar with wedges at Rivnopil and Zelenopole, leveraging numerical superiority. So, in Zaporizhia, Orikhiv, Kamyansk, small Russian advances since March 2025 involved the VDV and special forces at Pyatikhatki, Lobkove, Stepove, Orikhiv, and Malishevka. These are all verified. For how long we heard these names, right? The advances are really, really slow. Ukrainian defenses mirroring, obviously, the same Russia's Surovikin line, so the one that had been attentively forced in 2023 with, the Surovikin line. Right? It's minefields, trenches. Ukrainian defenses are in parallel to this, and they're all alike. So the Russians had mostly loaded that line with dragon teeth because of the Western tanks, etc. at the time, etc. But they themselves, as attacking the Ukrainian lines, have really limited gains, as we were talking about. Possibly at this point they're aiming to flank Orikhiv, but again, such a Bradipic speed. Ukrainian units, including Freedom of Russia. This is a splendid unit of actual Russian citizens fighting for Ukrainians. They're paramilitary. As you know, there is also a difference in these terms regarding some different groups that fight in different quality, etc. But it's there quite meaningfully. Then you have the 21st Berlin Guardian Battalion. These are all, in fact, Ukrainian forces. 7 special forces, the 11th operational, the 128th Mountain, and Katsus Kalinowski redeployed from Kharkiv in this sector to counter Russian forces, which retain almost all of Robotina's 23 defense units there. That, as you know, were a lot. So basically, they now, by passing to a counterattack throughout these years now, they have put an important pressure. Increased civilian vehicle use, bukankas, scooters, reflects in this case, aside from other factors, drone threats, which have been reducing armor use, with tanks supporting from 2 kilometers, and doorless vehicles allowing quick exits to preserve fleets and the crews. So basically you have tanks engaging from 2 kilometers away and ready to, also with some, other armor, etc., and other vehicles with dismantled, dismantled doors that are also armored, and so they should they're historically engineering wise conceived to protect the same crews, but at this point it's safer for the crews to jump out as soon as they realize they're going to be engaged by drones, which is interesting. Naturally, again, every war is fought in particular conditions. It's not like the Russians and Ukrainians are in top shape in the way they engage with sort of more, westernly conventional means, as far as, at least as they are in theory designed. And for a war like this, it would be very difficult. And actually the West is not learning too much either from what is going on. But that's also not, in fact, how a war would be really fought were we into that. In the Zarbets River area, so we're talking Kupiansk, Kreminna, Svatove, also very old names, Russian activity increases south, expanding a bridgehead. The 3rd Azov Brigade contains advances near Kopanki, Stepova, Serebryanka, and Kamyanka, which are all verified in Ukrainian possession, with 3 months of minor territorial exchanges. The area is not Russia's primary focus, limited by the river. Some observers they represent Ukrainians holding Russians at Kopanki in the north. South, between Kreminna and Liman, Russians secured a bridgehead, deploying the 1st Armored Regiment, the 59th, the 16th Spetsnaz Brigade, and additional units. From March 19th to May 2025, they captured Ivanivka, reached Katerinivka, and pushed towards Zarychne, where Ukrainian entrenchments hold firm. Anyway, Russians previously failed to breach Yampolivka or Torsk, but recently reached Torsk's outskirts, bypassing Zarychne via Bilikivka and engaging frontally with the 11th Armored Brigade in the Kreminna-Liman forests. By the way, that is not really, very enjoyable, I'd say. And the front remains static, with ongoing skirmishes, basically, also because the terrain, as you understand, just offers that's a very thick sort of orographic reality, hydrographic one, etc. So there is complex terrain with natural boundaries, right? In any case, Russia's heavy reserves there threatened to sever the area between the Zerbets and Oskil rivers, thus isolating Ukrainian units with limited retreat options for the latter via Oskil crossings, creating, in fact, a significant flank threat that is starting to appear there. Russian forces, after breaching between Torsk and Pokrovsk are deploying drones to target the Kramatorsk-Boyavlenka highway. This is the T-0504 indicating strikes deeper than the terrain suggests. Russia's battlefield advances align with its negotiation strategy, right? Russia is, again, not here committed to even prolonging peace talks, specifically to continue making territorial gains, leveraging these in negotiations to extract further concessions. But again, advances are small, right? So which actually seems to be extending, regardless of how any negotiation can turn to, as I was saying really before, to an indefinite time, right? And so conflating ceasefire talks with peace settlements talks risks delaying the same ceasefire's implementation, which should be at least the first step to act in a bit of a more calm situation, requiring, by the way, also in this sense, separate negotiations for robust monitoring mechanisms, which evidently we are verifying. I mean, this is the reality on the ground for those who care about the concreteness of it, also for what it means in a political sense. We can't talk about other aspects of this war beyond Ukraine. What kind of posture Russia has, because people are, as I was saying before, afraid also of direct confrontation with NATO, or at least there are voices of this kind. I am the voice of the West, and I absolutely understand why Western sources, NATO officials, are rightly warning about a possible Russian build-up after Ukraine, because of course in the moment they're not capable of doing anything, even if they want it. But of course there is a deeper idea, that is to say, watch out, because our own borders are being threatened. Actually, the greatest problem that here we know, I first of all, the most important thing is for the war in Ukraine to end, as far as we're concerned. But it's not like the Russians are going to attack NATO later, right? That Sualki Gap is very, very tempting from a strategic point of view, but it's not worth of any of the escalation or anything. There are many other countries that Russia can threaten without NATO actually being able to do much about that, and that are not as big as Ukraine, and so can create really lots of problems. On Ukraine, Moldova is also hinged de facto. But if we talk the Caucasus especially, that's another story. Turkey would surely do something about it, but in not just them, but let's say there is a difference between fighting between proxies and actually, say, at least nuclear powers, and especially of the kind of NATO and Russia. There is no doubt that Russia is expanding its military infrastructure along the Finnish and Estonian borders. This was reported by the New York Times on May the 19th and confirmed also by NATO officials. So again, this is not a surprise. I've even made in 2022 a video about Finland and its adhesion to NATO, and how much of actual pain behind it is for the Russians because of just the costs of defense that they have to, like in this case, they have to deploy for securing that border. Just even in case they want to show off as if they were to invade anybody, or they feel threatened by NATO in their greatest paranoid nightmares. That they should rightly have. It's the only reason Russia exists still as a single country, or barely a country, already in this way, is that they have nuclear weapons, right? Conventionally speaking, there is no way Russia has any edge on NATO at this point. We're not during the Cold War, right? It's when it wasn't, in fact, just about Russia or even just the Soviet Union, as you know. And in that point, in fact, it's nuclear weapons that helped us a little bit, in case you didn't notice. We would have been the first to be turned to ashes, in nuclear holocaust, but, After all, the entire world would have really been in pretty bad places anyway. Now, satellite imagery from August 2022 to August 2024 analyzed by different observers, now it's useless even to list the name, shows new aircraft, helicopters, tanks, vehicle storage, warehouses, fighter jet shelters, and helicopter bases at Olenia and Alakurti air bases. We're in the Murmansk Oblast. The Kamenka air base in the Komi Republic and Petrozavodsk air base in the Republic of Karelia. So the Finnish media report increased Russian military bases and deployments near the border. Not an immediate threat, of course, but a significant development with stockpiling of vehicles and ammo and reactivation of Cold War era bases, as the 200th Arctic Brigade was redeployed to Ukraine anyway, just for saying what's, of course, any priority for a country that, again, was the alleged second world military power. We were all aware of the problems of it, was stopped by the 23rd. Now, a senior NATO official stated that Russia will likely redeploy troops further north post-Ukraine. There's going to be a post-Ukraine. Assessing, by the way, Arctic access as key to Russia great power status. That's always been a thing, very underestimated. Never really made videos on Schwerpunkt on the topic, but we're going to expand it to 20th century, also Cold War era purpose. And you know that Trump's statements on Greenland are not really just, also in that, as I said before, you don't understand whether Trump is a genius or an idiot, or both at the same time, which is probably the most likely thing. But of course, Greenland is not just a random place, right? There is definitely an anti-Russian stance with the idea of a big United States, including ideally, of course, in another, parallel world, Canada, Greenland. Finnish defense officials that, of course, have their own interesting past predict a 5-year timeline for Russia to build threatening forces, potentially tripling border troops at that point. I made a video about the Soviet-Finnish war, and let's say we don't have to comment simply on saying, well, look at what happened back then. It's just like saying, I don't know, look at what happened to Napoleon or to the Nazis or whatever. Wars are all different, right? So nobody has to underestimate any threat, even if it is just like this. So it's not like Russia is actually a threat to NATO, because that's what Finland is now. But it's relevant because, of course, in case of war, at least the conventional scenario entails not just, in fact, the conventional, let's say, there is always the spectrum of nuclear. But in the meanwhile, just like during the Cold War, conventional troops would have not just been sitting there waiting for it. The Wall Street Journal reported in April 2025 that Western military and intelligence officials noted Russia upgrading railway lines and infrastructure along its western border with NATO. Russian presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev recently used narratives similar to those justifying Ukraine's invasion to threaten Finland, which is basically always the same Russian kind of passive-aggressive thing, suggesting preparation, at least ideally, intentionally, for future aggression, possibly defensive, even, though Russia lacks immediate capacity to invade anyone at this point, let alone NATO, any NATO country with also properly the intention of properly territorial conquest, right? So of any kind. So that's again, it's a wholly different topic. We can talk for hours about that in another video, but I'm not even trying at this point to make the same. Other other analysts assess that Russia attacking NATO within a decade is obviously unlikely due to its Ukraine commitments, but also in general, also the broader consequence of this economic challenges, including high inflation, elevated central bank rates, and Urals oil prices at $52 per barrel. That is 14% below Russia's Q1 2025 budget of $75. So we're not even going to discuss here what would happen if, say, Russia stopped the war in Ukraine to Russian economy. You know, what's the bottom line? They're basically all now turned towards that kind of war economy. And so it was so costly to get there. Imagine just disengaging. And that's one of the reasons why the Russians are just continuing at the end of the day, because at least the Russians are told, they do what they're told, and so they don't have much agency, except, again, if any government is the reflection of the direct moral majority of the people that green lighted it, with the Russians, it doesn't take even much moral force to be in charge to begin with, because the population is just subservient in that minimum, which does not mean it's even capable of enormous sacrifices. They just live in a sewer, which is a completely different reality. That's not one of strength. Russia's dependence on raw material exports limits growth. There is no doubt, by the way, either that wartime economies show resilience. It's not like that, I don't know, in 1944, Germany's production did not peak under heavy bombing, but you know how it ended, right? So the notion that, again, as I was saying in the beginning, that Russia is sustaining its war as a proof of basically they will win because they must win, it's BS, right? Of course, I'm not comparing it to Germany in 1944, where evidently things were much sort of worse, and there were so many different, it's not just that there weren't nuclear weapons used at that point, but properly there were conventional means whereby it was being surrounded and overwhelmed by an actual invasion. Of course, Russia today is not in that position, so it has is in a much better place compared to one of Germany in 1944, but it's not like its war effort is even just the type of enemy that is fighting. By the way, this is not the Soviet Union of 1944 against Germany. It's something completely different, in a completely different world. Is also, as I said before, something that can be continued, can be sustained, but at which cost and at which specific gain, nobody really understands. Right. As I was saying before, yes, attritional warfare, okay, but we have seen the theaters just right now. We have looked at the maps. This is not by any mean even a mean to an end. All right. This does not appear to be showing any kind of advantage for Russia. This is just constantly indebting yourself. And you can indebt yourself for a very long time without paying the price for it, right? It comes in different ways. So sanctions do not rapidly collapse Russia in that way, but they're definitely undermining much of its capabilities. Like, I don't know, the ones that were inflicted on Italy after the sustained Ethiopia campaign, right? It was also incredibly costly. We will talk about that at some point. Here, Russia is doing something similar. Some observers noted Russia's threat to NATO lies, as I was also making the case before myself, in targeting the Sualki Gap or the Baltics, which is not just because of the tiny stripe of land that, as you know, would create interesting scenarios also as far as the defense and its depth especially would be concerned, but especially because it is surrounded by countries that, if the Russian flanks of the spearhead of the invasion were to be exposed would entail the same Westerners having to cross, for example, into Belarus. And so at that point, triggering like at least a Russian response that could be escalatory if, in fact, NATO hadn't escalated at that point itself. So the Sualki Gap is not much important for just this, but the fact that a major gamble could take, however, a very short time to seize it for basically anybody to be stunned and not to do anything about. But of course, even if forces had been accumulated there would be a major NATO response beforehand by degrees. By the way, it's not like people think that nuclear wars are literally like a guy pushes a button and they got no. If you look at NATO protocol, the Russians had, but this is something notorious during the Cold War, like dozens of escalatory steps before you go full, blowing up each other's metropolises all across the globe, right? That's not how it goes. In any case, the Russians, some strategists say, some analysts say that the Russians also in this case, as I was pointing out, would exploit Western reluctance to deploy ground troops, which I disagree with in the sense that the Baltics and Poland wouldn't simply be the type of countries that would do that, and it surely would have the full support of NATO and lots of other countries, not just Western ones. So the Russians lull a bit themselves too much in this notion, which is purely, alienated, that the Westerners are not resourceful. Instead, the Russians are, right? Because they survived the Nazis, and so now the Westerners are a bunch of debauched, corrupted people. That's, I don't know how to show it to them, but, I think that it's not even something we need to show them if they're going to fail anyway, as long as they don't drag us into something more serious. And so this notion of even, a broader story, recruitment shortages, would this be even just a matter of demographics? Russia is in deep, deep blip because of that as well. It's not like Russia is any traditional pole of spirituality, of culture. It's a terrible country. Even just by post-Soviet standards, Ukraine is a much more religious, traditional, spiritual country than Russia is. And, the way these things are misrepresented is utterly ridiculous, honestly, by propaganda. But, say, lesser people, undereducated people, of course, at least believe that, which is basically just a feministic fantasy equating to the LGBTQ ideology. They are the same thing. Like if your left sucks in your culture, it's because your right sucks equally, right? You're a lesser people. And this is the point. But for how many problems the West can have within itself, they're nothing compared to Russia's. And the fact that Russians are more sort of habituated to that does not make them stronger by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, makes them chronically weaker. Even for any possible resurgence that is definitely not on the horizon. The notion that BRICS would be this replacers is completely BS. Like the West had with the best resources ever, like this sort of amortization of issues, etc. Like when countries like Russia, China, India, Brazil will sort of halt, and this already happens with China, by the way, and Russia, by the way, they don't have the mortgages that we have, all right? They're completely blipped up. And we will see this, right? And hopefully, if anything, if they're going to do something about it, they may hope to become a bit more normal people to begin with. In any case, the idea of also like a possible engagement of Sualki Gap is, worth another video. Arestovich highlighted Russia's reliance on Western aversion to ground combat, but I think it's BS, honestly. I've seen things changing so fast, for example, just during this war in Ukraine, that frankly, I believe it's total BS, right? It's a culturalistic presumption that does not hold ground when, you can easily change your mind so quickly. We've seen it in the West also for the worst reasons, right? Today, you're going to be shot at yourself, you're going to immediately go at war, and there's surely going to be some sort of revival of nationalism, of imperialism, or whatever, regardless of its implications, like they are going to be easily found back again. Some think that the problem could be the fact that a Russian incursion into Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania would encounter NATO battalions designed to delay until rapid reaction forces, primarily from Poland, engage. So, again, it's unpredictable in the premises, because it's not like what it's conceived now is simply what would actually happen by the point the Russians may try something like that. Because we don't know how many troops there are actually going to be deployable at the time. And before Russians, it's not like something you can hide, all right? It's just like Ukraine. We knew this from a long time, right? Remember in early 2021, also against any propaganda that denied like that this happened or that the Americans were just claiming, barking at the wind. We know what happened, of course. It's so weird how, again, the entire thing became, supporting Ukraine became like a pro-left, which has never actually been fully, but in the propaganda, like a pro-Biden, just because Biden was in charge and power, all right? Nevertheless, that helped it a lot, to say the least. But in any case, there is different considerations one could make. Modern warfare, at least our contemporary warfare, and also one fact between the West and Russia at this point, would prioritize long-range systems, right? The problem with Sualki Gap is that 300,000 entrenched troops require ground combat, which Russians and Ukrainians undertake at the moment, unlike Western forces. Russia tests NATO with sabotage and hybrid warfare to assess response thresholds, but it's evident that this isn't quite feasible. The 60-kilometer Sualki Gap, separating Kaliningrad from Belarus, is vulnerable, yes, despite NATO's Baltic Sea dominance. But again, it's not like you can wake up the day after with the Russians having breached this. It's not about the technical availability. It's not even about the fact that it couldn't be possible for this thing to happen at some point under certain circumstances and NATO not to react. The point is that Russia would have literally to go at war with NATO. This is the most important thing. And it's not like we can sleep on it, because this is literally what we're all habituated to do. We just realize what the threats are. We develop some responses. Some can be belated, can be just maybe not fully adequate, but it's not like their responses are better than ours. All right. So it's not like nuclear war happens and, I don't know, one side wins or the other loses. That's why we have that arsenal. All right. So even if NATO's strategy assumes temporary loss of the Baltics with liberation planned later, the notion is that still those hundreds of thousands of NATO troops would be deployed somewhere to, for example, enter Belarus to do something which would be at that point an equal response to the Russian threat. And imagine, of course, like the more likely scenario of a Ukraine that stands there independent, and the Russians that maybe, yes, are able at some point to put together many forces. What about Ukraine? Like, if the problem is nuclear force at that point, how does Russia defend all its boundaries? Right? Especially with Ukraine, NATO is basically, in this sense, impregnable, first of all, but also capable of simply pushing through conventionally speaking. It is now. Imagine, in 2022, Poland alone would have been enough to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine. Conventionally, together with the Ukrainians, all right? So this entire thing is ridiculous, in my opinion. And so you can have, for example, UK, it's fine. It's fine that, I don't know, the UK media comment suggesting reluctance to defend Tallinn, for example, reflecting an uncertain Western commitment. right? At this point, we have, for example, Italy's Prime Minister Meloni was always supportive of Ukraine, of Zelensky, of NATO, of the general, also American alignment. But for example, she opposes ground troop deployment because of reasons diverging from France, Germany, the UK, but also Poland and the Baltics that, as you understand here, are in the first line. And it's not like a war like that would not involve anybody, right? But you can see how there are two different levels, right? Because it's just like during the Cold War. The point of the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact in general would have been to advance across Central Europe, reaching the Atlantic. It's not like they gave a damn about, for example, central, southern Italy, all right? And so today, equally on the other side, you have Poland that is on our side, and then Germany that is united, and France that are obviously the first ones in line, together with the Baltics that are, again, independent and part of NATO, etc. So if a country like Italy, for example, says at this point in the war where nobody can simply inject soldiers because we need a ceasefire, we need at least then a peace of some sort, and then trying to enter Ukraine, which, the Russians do not want to do it because it's one of their yet another alleged red lines. It's not like if the Italian Prime Minister today says, okay, for now we don't send troops, by the way, they accepted to some kind of level later, this changes anything in the equation. All right. It doesn't change anything in the equation. Even France, Germany, Britain, Poland saying, okay, we're going to send troops to Ukraine. When? They don't specify that. It's a good signal. It's a positive signal. But it's not something that is immediately expandable just because you say that. All right. The situation is more serious in a way. It's mostly always a matter of the United States primarily, as we were saying before. But I would say, look at the Ukrainians. Look at what kind of unity exists in Ukraine. And as I said before, it's not like a country can defend itself just with allies, right? A country survives an aggression because it rests on its legs, and that's the only way allies can support it. And so regardless of all the BS of, oh, look, they're taking these Ukrainians from the street to send them to the front. Well, how do you think actually in a country with martial law, people are recruited just like they're all going to say, okay, yes, I want to go to the front, right? The difference between Russia and Ukraine is that Ukraine shows you their own police doing this stuff, right? And Russia doesn't. So, nevertheless. So Western military aid, by the way, to Ukraine persists. It's always scarce compared to what we could do, there is no doubt. However, the most recent news are Australia receiving approval to transfer 49 retired Abrams tanks. Originally US supplied, of course. They could have also come through other ways, but nearly doubling the 31-34 tanks sent directly by the US, as confirmed by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese during a May 18 meeting with Zelensky. So, okay, again, it's not like 31 MBTs are everything, regardless also how they are fitted out, etc. This war is big, and so this is just a little help that is surely going to save Ukrainian lives, but they need much more. And of course, we're giving it to them, because silently, even so sleepy Europe is actually sending stuff. And it's not like, again, the Russians enjoy this overwhelming superiority, because there is a difference between numbers and expendability. We shouldn't rest on this. We shouldn't say, okay, so we are the Westerners, we're sending enough. No, we're not sending enough. All right. But we are gradually getting somewhere much better than we were, of course, a few years ago. And we're doing this from a much stronger position than Russia, that may provide unitarily more in the way they do, but again, with costs that we wouldn't minimally pay. even if we were to spend, I don't know, 3 times what we do today on defense. So unfortunately, we're playing this stupid game on the skins of the Ukrainians. That is our own skins in literally the same sense. I mean, not just Ukraine is with us now for good, but it's like we're going to pay for not having paid them enough anyway. And this doesn't necessarily mean you'll die in a nuclear holocaust because of a war with Russia, but you will pay that economically anyway. Like the notion that if you don't pay a minimal amount for Ukraine, you'll be richer later is just like what I think even a 4-year-old would immediately understand to be an idiocy, considering what Russia is capable of doing later and all the costs that we have to structurally and systemically pay just to keep them at bay somewhere else that will be much more difficult to contain. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation reported on May the 19th that the first tanks, by the way of the aforementioned bulk, are en route. Denmark announced on May the 17th a 4.2 billion Danish kroner, about $632 million, which is not a few, aid package for a period stretching from 2025 to 2028, however, so it's going to be delayed, of course, a long time, distributed a long time, including artillery systems, ammo, fighter jet equipment, and Ukrainian Air Force training funding at the same time. So it's not all weapons, all right? The Finnish, which is the main problem, because at large we can give a lot of money to Ukraine. The problem is, again, ammo, right? We can also train them home, but it's better if we, in parallel with that, we give them ammo or in a easy comparison, we pay ammo for ammo, so produce ammo. The Finnish Ministry of Defense announced the other day, an agreement with the European Commission to supply Ukraine with material and heavy ammo worth 90 million, so about a bit more than $100 million at this rate of exchange, using profits from Russian frozen assets. This a forced contrast with Trump's strategy of reducing Ukraine aid to facilitate negotiations with Putin that, however, shouldn't be taken necessarily as, what is specifically in Trump's view the best way. It's true, however, that some US officials view the Australian transfer as indirect equipment supply. Rubio's sanction threats likely also prompted the Trump-Putin call, as we've seen. And in any case, we've seen how the Russians stalling to delayed sanctions yields minimal progress, suggesting negotiations, again, may serve as a prolonged distraction in the US will actually, as they are talking about, and you see, like, it's not often emphasized talking about sanctions, at least threatening that and realistically. So I would just make a reference to Libya as well, because as you know, there are essentially two governments, one propped by Russia, that in a way has to do also with Turkey historically, and again, we don't have to go back into specific historical backgrounds to know what we're talking about. Turkey supports al-Julani's militia in Syria, exploiting Russia's setbacks. That actually was a massive strike. I don't know about you, but I was so excited when in Kazakhstan, just in December 2021, there was that attempt coup that I'm sure never really gone depth into that, but was likely an attempt to distract the Russians, or to tell them, watch out, don't do this. And it's not much. I imagine the Americans being behind that, but the Turks have a very important Central Asian connection with all those Sunnis, co-ethnicity, I don't know how to say that are actually like all the 1/5 of Russian population, like something terrible, right? In terms of, by the way, immigrants in Russia, like, yes, in EU we have enormous problems and we're gradually turning around that, but Russia does not even have the capacity of doing without those guys, and they have as many as you can imagine. That proportion is insane. Speaking of the traditional Russia, any American complaining about socialism is welcome to go live in the actual post-Soviet Russia, especially Putin's Russia, to see how non-socialistic that is, by the way. And being sarcastic in case you didn't get that. And the Libyan situation is frozen, right? Both sides maintain agreements but seek dominance if opportunities arise. This is not good. It's not much because of just the immigrants as well, because that there is the Russians attempted, especially in the first year, to leverage also the Ukrainian grain crisis, etc., to push immigrants to Europe, etc. Like Libya is that close to Italy. It's a space that actually the Westerners can easily dominate. There is also the question of whether removing Gaddafi was good or not, right? Similar to Iraq, right? Causing chaos without a post-war plan. Again, we will see this scenario at some point in some depth. I have my own idea about it as well. That is often against the common one, but not because of the reasons some people think it could be, on the contrary, quite the opposite. Because I think there is a lot of confusion indeed. But one could question, of course, the lack of strategy behind certain military strikes. There is no doubt that Russia remains inflexible, demanding full control of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts despite incomplete control, offering only prisoner swaps as, okay, we're negotiating, but that's not basically leading elsewhere. Many other prisoners are being captured at the same time. No compromise is evident, as Putin reiterated himself last week, by the way. And by acknowledging this rigidity, we notice the challenge of finding a path of short surrender that satisfies Russia, which is the only reason why the war is being fought, Russia, and achieves peace, right? So the entire notion that the root causes, so again, the whole BS of how Ukraine does not exist at Similia, is exactly like the proof that, of course, Russians never had good faith even once in all this, and they are simply habituated to lie as the sole characteristic of their allegedly national identity, right? So it's a world full of paranoia, of trauma, of mental and material misery. It's something you can't even understand if you don't come from one of those places, but you can at least document to the degree. We're also just looking at, if you wonder whether what we discussed here is a serious is an actually existing country, like, yeah, it actually exists. These are actual people who actually believe behave like this, and they don't believe, of course, even themselves what they're saying, but in the sense that it's not, they're simply lying. They lie as they don't know what the truth is supposed to be. That's the actual difference, and that's why these things happen, unfortunately. So I really wanted to do this, and I'm really glad to have made this video. We're going surely to update this stuff because it's important. I don't know how frequently I'm going to make it. It's probably not going to happen very soon. But of course, for any major update, we can go look into it. And again, it's as if there are always major updates if you live there and if you are part of the thing. But unfortunately, resolutory updates, or fortunately maybe escalatory updates, are something else, right? And so they're not something that, we're closer to the former ones, yes, the conclusive ones, yes, the escalatory ones, not even if the end is near, because in theory, the bottom line, the Russians don't win. They could use nuclear weapons. I call BS on that. If it wasn't, aside from the fact that it's ridiculous, just at a strictly aside from the political one, but even military speaking, you don't change anything, right? It's not like you wipe out enemy armies by using nuclear weapons. That's not a thing, all right? They thought they could, I mean, at some point, even the Americans tried the option and they, before Iraq, and they realized that they had to throw, I don't know how many, several tens of tactical nukes to wipe out an entire Iraqi division, and they said, okay, let's do it the conventional way. But again, I'm telling you the obvious, right? I hope that, I don't know how many views this video is gonna get, but it's not like I'm telling you something that requires a higher sophistication to know. At least if you have just followed the thing, if you know anything about this, you would think the same yourself. The problem is that most people do not even care, do not even know anything, but they want to say their own thing. And this is a problem. It's always a problem, etc. And again, we will also continue with our series of military history, because I have lots of beautiful videos, but recently I made so many specials, or better, so many kind of historian kind of, you know what the historian is for the newcomers. It's basically the playlist where I talk about general stuff and, so philosophical terms, either about the channel or whatever. That I still prepare a video every day. It doesn't take too much, but again, there are so many videos in advance I can't make even. I could start doing so also for recording, so that I have not just makeshift videos, but actual fully fledged videos for when I go on vacations and stuff like that. Whatever. So, of course, Slava Ukraini, because, that's the only bottom line possible. For today, I stop it here. However, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.